She walked into that competition carrying 50 pounds of smoked brisket, a cast iron skillet older than most of the men in the room, and a lifetime of being told she was too much, too big, too loud, too stubborn to matter. The crowd laughed before she even set down her basket. The head judge, Gideon Ashcroft, looked her up and down with the kind of contempt that doesn't need words, then made a joke anyway. What happened next silenced every man, woman, and child in that Wyoming valley, and started something none of them would ever forget. If this is your first time here, welcome. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The morning of the territorial cooking competition, Marlo Quinn was already awake before the sun touched the ridgeline. She hadn't slept much. The cot in the back room of Etta Calhoun's boarding house wasn't built for comfort, and the walls were thin enough that she'd heard two men arguing in the next room until well past midnight, something about card debts and a horse that probably didn't exist. She lay on her back listening to them, staring at the ceiling and thinking about her mother's skillet. It was the one thing she'd managed to carry out when her cousins took the boarding house. Everything else, the furniture, the linens, the kitchen equipment her mother had spent 20 years collecting, all of it had been stripped and sold inside of a week after the papers were filed. Marlo had been 23 years old and too stunned to fight back fast enough. By the time she'd gathered herself, there was nothing left to fight over. That was 6 years ago. She sat up, swung her legs off the cot, and pressed her bare feet against the cold floor. Outside, Harwick was still dark and mostly quiet. A dog barked somewhere near the stockyards. Wagon wheels creaked on the main road. An early supply run, probably. She could smell someone else's cook fire through the window crack. Marlo stood, which was not a small event. She was a large woman, tall and broad through the shoulders, with hands that had spent more time wrapped around a skillet handle than anything softer. She'd long since stopped apologizing for the space she occupied. Life was too short, and the days too long for that particular waste of energy. She washed her face from the basin, pulled her dark hair back tight, and dressed in her good apron, the heavy canvas one with deep pockets, reinforced at the hem. She'd pressed it the night before. She wasn't vain about most things, but she was serious about presentation, and she'd learned early that when people were already looking for reasons to dismiss you, you didn't hand them easy ones. The competition was being held at the Territorial Fairgrounds on the east end of Harwick, in the big exhibition hall that usually housed livestock judging. Marlo had been past it twice the day before, walking the grounds, clocking where the cook stations were set up, noting the fuel supply situation. Green wood piled on one side, seasoned oak on the other. She'd made her choices accordingly. She picked up her mother's skillet from where it rested on the floor beside the cot, wrapped it in her carrying cloth, and tucked it under her arm. Then she picked up the brisket. She'd started the brisket 2 days ago. She'd spent her own money on the beef, a chunk of the small reserve she'd built up over the past 3 years cooking for trail crews and winter camps out of a converted supply wagon. The brisket had been seasoned dry and left to rest, then slow cooked over a measured hardwood fire through most of the previous day and night. It was resting now in its juices, wrapped in cloth, inside a sealed iron vessel. It was, by her honest assessment, the best piece of meat she'd ever prepared. She'd eat the loss if she lost, but she didn't intend to lose. The fairgrounds were a mile's walk from the boarding house. Marlo made it in 20 minutes, moving at her own pace, ignoring the cold that came off the fields on either side of the road. By the time she arrived, there were already 11 other competitors setting up their stations. She knew some of them by sight. Frank Odell, who ran the chop house on Merchant Street, had brought 2 assistants and enough equipment to outfit a small hotel kitchen. Dorothea Banks, the widow who catered for the Cattlemen's Association dinners, was arranging her ingredients with the precise efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times. A younger man, couldn't have been more than 19, was sweating through his collar already, trying to get his fire started with damp kindling. Marlo found her assigned station, set down her supplies, and began to work. She wasn't performing. That was the thing people sometimes misread about her at these moments. She wasn't putting on a show of calm. She genuinely had things to do, and she was focused on doing them. She got her fire going. Seasoned oak, controlled draft, exactly how she needed it. She unwrapped the brisket and assessed it in the pale early light. It had rested beautifully. The bark was set and dark, and when she pressed it lightly with 2 fingers, the meat gave back the way it should. She began building the rest of the plate in her head. She'd brought pickled vegetables she'd put up herself, sweet and sharp, nothing fancy, just correct. There was a pan sauce she'd reduced to order. She'd prepared a cornbread specifically calibrated to hold up against the richness of the beef without fighting it. She was deep in her prep work when she heard the laughter. It wasn't subtle. It was the kind of laughter that wanted to be heard, loud enough to carry across the hall, shaped to humiliate. She didn't look up immediately. She finished transferring the brisket to her cutting board, set it squarely, and then lifted her eyes. He was standing near the judge's table at the far end of the hall, Gideon Ashcroft. She recognized him from the broadsheet announcement that had accompanied the competition notice. Mountain Ranger, decorated territorial scout, well-known figure across 4 counties. He was a lean, weathered man, somewhere in his mid-40s, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and eyes that moved across everything with the habitual calculation of someone accustomed to reading terrain. He was speaking with 2 other men, the town alderman, she thought, and someone she didn't recognize. And he was looking at her. He was making a joke. She couldn't hear the words from across the hall, but she could hear the tone and she could see the gesture. His hands held wide apart in the approximate shape of something large, his expression performing exaggerated surprise. The 2 men laughed. Someone else nearby laughed. Marlo set down her knife. She was familiar with this particular experience. It had been a feature of her life for as long as she could remember. The way some men needed to establish their position by diminishing hers, as though her size were an invitation, as though she existed specifically to be the punchline they needed. She had never found a way to make it stop hurting entirely. She didn't think there was one, but she had found a way to keep moving after it happened, and that turned out to be more useful than the alternative. She picked up her knife again and continued her prep. The competition was structured in 2 rounds. The first was a timed preparation. Each competitor had 2 hours to produce a complete meal plate, which would then be presented to the panel of 3 judges for blind evaluation. The second round, if there was a tie or if the judges requested it, would involve a direct question and answer with the cook. Marlo had done competitions before. Smaller ones, a county fair in her 20s, a cattleman's supper contest the year before last that she'd won, but that had never quite paid what it promised. She understood the rhythms of them. She knew how to pace herself. She knew how to manage a fire through a long cook without letting attention drift. She knew that the 2-hour window was actually quite forgiving if you'd done your preparation correctly, and punishing if you hadn't. She worked quietly. Frank Odell's station was the noisiest. He kept issuing instructions to his assistants in the sharp, quick voice of a man who needed to hear himself being the authority. Dorothea Banks worked in complete silence, her movements small and economical. The young man with the bad kindling finally got his fire going, but had started too late, and Marlo could see from across the aisle that he was already behind his own timeline. An hour in, she started the pan sauce. The smell of rendered fat and caramelized fond in the skillet began to reach the neighboring stations, and she noticed Frank Odell glance over with an expression that shifted too quickly for him to fully disguise. She reduced the sauce in stages, building the layers, tasting twice. She thought about her mother, who had taught her that patience was the actual technique, that most cooks tried to rush what couldn't be rushed, and that the food always knew. With 20 minutes left, she began assembling the plate. The brisket sliced cleanly, with the grain, the way it was supposed to. The interior was the color and texture she'd aimed for. Not pink, not gray, precisely the middle territory that took time and attention to achieve. She plated it over a folded cloth. She'd lay it on the board for transport, fanned the pickled vegetables to the side, added the cornbread, sauced the plate with the controlled pour she'd practiced, wiped the rim. She looked at it for a moment. It was good. It was actually very good. She let herself acknowledge that privately, without ceremony. She covered the plate and waited for the collection bell. The judging was conducted at a table set up on a raised platform at the hall's east end, in full view of everyone present. The plates were brought up by a runner with numbers only. The names were sealed in envelopes that wouldn't be opened until after scoring. The 3 judges worked through each plate systematically, tasting, writing, conferring in low voices. Gideon Ashcroft sat at the center of the table. Marlo watched him the way she watched everything, steadily, without apparent emotion, filing away what she observed. He tasted carefully. He wasn't performing his expertise the way some judges did, making a production of every reaction. He wrote brief notes after each plate. He asked occasional quiet questions of the judge to his left, a woman named Clara Finch, who Marlowe understood ran the Territorial Agricultural Office and had organized this competition for 3 years running. When her plate came up, she knew it by the timing. She'd counted the order. Gideon picked up the fork. He cut a piece of the brisket. He put it in his mouth. The change in his expression was subtle. A slight stilling, a recalibration of some kind. He chewed slowly. He set down his fork and picked up his pen and wrote something. He cut another piece. He didn't perform a reaction. That, she thought, was interesting in its own way. The scoring took another hour after the final plate was collected. Competitors were free to mill around the hall, eat from the communal table that had been set up near the entrance, or wait outside. Marlowe stayed at her station and cleaned it. She washed her skillet, dried it properly, wiped down the work surface, repacked her supplies. She drank water from her canteen. Frank Odell made 2 circuits of the hall, speaking with people, radiating the confident ease of someone who believed the outcome was already settled. He caught Marlowe's eye once and gave her a nod that was not exactly warm but was not openly hostile. The particular diplomatic neutrality of a man who doesn't want to make enemies until the results are announced. Clara Finch came down from the judges' table and made a brief round of the room, thanking competitors for their participation. She stopped at Marlowe's station. "Good work today?" she said. "Simple, even. Not warm, but not empty." "Thank you," Marlowe said. Clara Finch looked at her for a moment with an expression that was harder to read. "Have you competed before?" "Small shows, nothing like this. Your fire management was notable. Several of us mentioned it." She moved on before Marlowe could respond. Marlowe thought about that. She put the lid back on her storage vessel and waited. The announcement was made by the alderman, a florid man named Tuttle, who clearly enjoyed having a platform and used it at some length before arriving at the results. There was a third-place finish for a cook named Halverson, who ran a bunkhouse kitchen out near the Silver Creek Range. Polite applause. There was a second-place finish for Dorothea Banks, who received it with a gracious nod and the controlled smile of someone who'd expected first but wouldn't say so. "And first place," Tuttle said, drawing it out unnecessarily, with a unanimous decision from all 3 judges. He looked at the envelope. He looked up. He looked at the envelope again. Marlowe Quinn. The room was quieter than it should have been for a first-place announcement. Not hostile quiet. More the particular silence of a room recalibrating. Marlowe walked up to the platform. She shook Tuttle's hand. She took the ribbon, a thing of no particular value, but she held it anyway. She turned to face the judges and found herself looking directly at Gideon Ashcroft. He wasn't looking away. He wasn't pretending to be occupied with his notes. He was looking at her with an expression that she couldn't entirely categorize, and after a moment he said with enough volume for the people immediately around them to hear, "Best brisket I've tasted in 12 years of judging these things. Maybe longer." Someone in the small crowd around the platform made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a gasp. A murmur ran through the room. Marlowe looked at him steadily. "That's the honest verdict," she said, "or the diplomatic one?" A beat. His jaw shifted. "Honest. Then I'll take it." She stepped off the platform and walked back toward her station. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed. It was only when she reached the familiar ground of her clean work surface, her packed supplies, her mother's skillet wrapped and ready to travel, that she allowed herself a long, slow exhale. She was loading her supplies onto the wagon she'd hired for the day when she heard boots on the gravel behind her. She turned. It was Gideon Ashcroft, moving with the particular economy of a man who'd spent decades navigating difficult terrain and had no excess motion left in him. He stopped a reasonable distance away. He had his hat in his hands, which she noticed. "Miss Quinn," he said. "Mr. Ashcroft." A pause. He seemed, for the first time since she'd observed him, uncertain of his next words, not in a helpless way, but in the way of a man composing something he'd decided mattered and wanted to get right. "I said something before the judging started," he said. "In the hall. I didn't think you heard it." I heard the tone, she said. I didn't need the words. He took that without flinching, which she gave him some credit for. It wasn't right. I'm saying so directly because I don't know another way to say it that means anything. Marlowe looked at him for a long moment. The late afternoon light was going gold across the fairgrounds, catching the dust still hanging in the air from the competition day's traffic. Somewhere behind her, the young cook with the bad kindling was loading his own wagon, muttering to himself. Apology received, she said finally. It wasn't warm, but it was honest. He nodded. She thought that was the end of it. She turned back to her loading. I have a proposition, he said, to her back. She paused. Of what kind? The kind you'll likely think is presumptuous, and I'll probably explain badly, he said, which was unexpected enough that she turned around again. I've been looking to establish a trading post, Gideon said. Not in town, up on the Gray Spine Ridge where the trapping routes cross. Good position for it. Settlers moving through, native traders, range crews coming in from the north. But I'm a better ranger than I am a cook, which has been the limiting factor. He stopped. There's a full kitchen space in what I've been building. It's never been used. Marlowe looked at him. You're asking me to cook for your trading post. I'm asking you to run the kitchen, he said. Equal share of the profits, full authority over that operation, your name on the agreement. She was quiet for a moment. The wind picked up briefly, carrying sawdust and the smell of horse from the stockyard side of the fairgrounds. Why? She said. It wasn't rhetorical. She wanted the actual answer. He seemed to understand that. Because I watched you work today, he said. And because the frontier out here doesn't have anything like what you'd build. And because I made a fool of myself in front of a hall full of people this morning, and the person I made a fool of is the one who deserved to win. None of those reasons is enough on its own. Together they might be. Marlowe studied him. He was a hard man to read, not because he was deceptive, but because he was genuinely economical. There wasn't a lot of performance in him, which meant she had less to interpret and had to trust what she actually saw. What she saw was a man who was uncomfortable. Not with her specifically, with himself. With having done something mean-spirited in public and having to live in the aftermath of it. She'd seen that particular discomfort before, and she knew there were two ways it resolved. Some men buried it under justifications until it disappeared, and some men did something about it. She didn't know yet which kind he was, but the offer itself was real. She could see that. I'd want to see the space first, she said. That's reasonable. And I'd want the agreement in writing before anything else happens. Also reasonable. And I'd want to know, she said, that if we disagree about something, the kitchen, the operation, anything, we settle it the same way you settled it today, directly. He looked at her steadily. I can commit to that. She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back to her loading and began working through the last of her supplies. I'll look at the space, she said. That's all I'm agreeing to tonight. That's all I'm asking for tonight, he said. She heard him put his hat back on. She heard his boots on the gravel moving away. She lifted the iron vessel, the brisket vessel, her best one, and secured it in the wagon bed. It had been a strange day. She was tired in the way she got tired after high-focus work, depleted but not empty, the way a well-used fire burns down to good coals rather than ash. She wasn't certain about anything yet. She'd made no commitments. She'd accepted nothing. But she was thinking about the kitchen space on the Gray Spine Ridge. She was thinking about a professional operation, a real one. Not a converted supply wagon, not a borrowed space, but something built, something that bore her name. She clicked her tongue at the horse, picked up the reins, and started back toward town through the darkening afternoon. Behind her, the fairgrounds were emptying out. Lanterns were coming on in the exhibition hall. The competition ribbons were still hanging from the announcement board, a thin strip of red at the top, and if you were standing at the right angle, you could read the name written in block letters underneath it. Marlowe Quinn. She didn't look back at it. She already knew what it said. She spent 3 days thinking about the offer. Not obsessing over it. She had work to do, the trail crew contract she'd already committed to, supplies to reorder, correspondence to write. But the offer moved through the background of her days like a current under still water. She kept returning to it at odd moments. While she was trimming beef for the trail camp, while she was lying in the dark on Etta's cot listening to the buildings settle. What she knew about Gideon Ashcroft she'd mostly learned from incidental sources in the days after the competition. He was well regarded as a ranger. That was universal. He'd served in 2 territorial campaigns in his early career and had come out of them with the kind of reputation that comes from being both effective and honest about what effectiveness cost. He'd been on the Grayspine territory for 8 years, running scout work for the Territorial Land Office and doing occasional consultation for the railroad surveys, though she'd heard mixed things about how that particular relationship had developed. His brother had been in the territory too, she heard, past tense. She didn't know the details and she didn't ask about them. What she knew about herself was longer and more familiar. She knew she was good at this work. Not good for a woman in a difficult situation good, not good considering good. Just genuinely, technically good, and she'd worked hard to get there. She knew she could run an operation. She'd effectively run her mother's boarding house kitchen from the time she was 16, managing inventory and staff and a dining room that fed 30 guests a night at peak, before the cousins had come in with their papers and their sharp smiles and their lawyers. She knew that what Gideon Ashcroft was offering, if he meant it the way he'd said it, was the closest thing to real opportunity she'd had since she was 23 years old, and everything her family had built had been taken from her in the space of a bad week. She also knew that trusting a man she'd met once, who'd mocked her publicly and then apologized and made an offer in the same afternoon, was not the careful thing to do. But she was 30 years old, and she was tired of careful. Careful had kept her alive. It hadn't gotten her much else. On the 4th day, she sent a note to the address he'd left her, a relay point at the Territorial Land Office in Harwick, asking when he could show her the Grayspine property. His response came back the next morning. "Tomorrow, if you're willing to ride. It's about 3 hours north." She was willing to ride. He met her at the edge of town at first light, on a gray horse that had seen some use and moved with the calm efficiency of an animal that had been well treated and knew its work. He had a pack horse loaded with what looked like building materials, lumber, hardware, wrapped bundles she didn't identify. He wasn't traveling light, which she read as confirmation that the Grayspine operation was real and ongoing, not a concept he'd assembled on short notice to make an offer. They rode mostly in silence for the first hour. It wasn't uncomfortable silence. It was working silence, the kind where 2 people were occupied with their own thoughts, and there was no social debt that required filling. She appreciated that about him. Some men couldn't tolerate quiet around a woman. They felt compelled to fill it, as though silence between them were a problem to be solved. Gideon Ashcroft didn't seem to feel that compulsion. When he did speak, it was practical. "Trail's going to get rougher about 2 miles north of the second creek crossing," he said. "Your horse is shod?" "Yes?" "Good. There's a section where the ground's been soft since last month's rain. Go single file and watch the left edge." She noted it. It was the kind of information you gave to someone you were taking seriously as a traveling companion. Not instructions delivered from above, just relevant data shared between people covering the same ground. The Grayspine Ridge came into view late in the 2nd hour, a long, dark-timbered rise against the northern sky, broken at its midpoint by an outcropping of gray granite that gave it the name. The trading post was built against the base of the outcropping, tucked into a natural windbreak where the rock curved south. It was larger than she'd expected. There was a main structure, solid log construction, 2 stories, a long covered porch running the front elevation. A secondary building behind it connected by a covered walkway, newer construction by the look of the wood. A well. A stable that could handle at least 6 horses. The road approach was wide enough for a loaded freight wagon. "You've been building this a while," she said. 3 years, Gideon said. "Off and on. More on in the last year." They dismounted, and he led her through the main structure first, a trading room with long counters along 2 walls, shelving systems built into the north side, a loading door for freight on the east. Clean, utilitarian, intelligently laid out. Then through the covered walkway to the secondary building. The kitchen space was the entire secondary structure. It was a serious room, a serious empty room. The fireboxes were built but not fitted out. The counter space was raw lumber. There was nothing on the walls, but the bones of it were exactly right. Good ventilation design, counter heights that someone had thought about, drainage, space for a wood supply that accessed from outside. She walked it slowly. She checked the fireboxes. She checked the floor grade. She stood in the center and turned in a slow circle, thinking about workflow, about service direction, about where a second workstation would need to go for high-volume days. "You built this space," she said. "Someone told you how to build it? or you planned it yourself? I planned it, he said, based on what I've watched work in the camps and what I've watched not work. The floor grade is right. Took me a while to figure that out. She crouched and looked at the seam where the wall met the floor. Clean join, no gaps. Whoever had built this had been careful. She stood up. Tell me what the agreement looks like, she said, in specific terms. He told her. He'd thought it through. 60-40 split in her favor during the first year, with equal share from year 2 onward, the adjustment structured as a recognition that she'd be building something from nothing in the first season. Full authority over kitchen operations, staffing if she needed it, menu and pricing decisions. Her name on the agreement and on the post itself. She could walk away with 30 days' notice and take her equipment and any income owed. She stood in the empty kitchen and listened to all of it. The 60-40, she said. You structured it in my favor on purpose. Yes. Why? Because you're building the operation, he said, and because I could have offered it differently and I didn't want to. She was quiet for a moment. The wind came through one of the unfinished window openings and moved the sawdust on the floor. There are people who won't like this, she said. A woman running a trading post operation. A particular kind of woman. I know. Have you thought about what that means practically? Not in principle, but practically. He looked at her. I've been living on the frontier for 20 years, he said. I've thought about it. She looked out the kitchen window at the gray granite outcropping above them, the dark timber beyond it, the sky that was moving with weather coming in from the northwest. She thought about her mother's kitchen. She thought about the boarding house she'd grown up in, the dining room she'd helped run, the smell of food and people, and the particular kind of belonging that came from feeding someone well. She thought about the cousins and their papers and their sharp smiles. She thought about 6 years of careful. She thought about the competition ribbon, red on a board, her name in block letters underneath it. I want a written agreement before the end of this week, she said. I want it reviewed by someone I choose, and I want to be operational before the first frost. Gideon Ashcroft looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the closest thing to it she'd seen from him. I'll have a draft to you by Thursday, he said. She nodded. She took one more look at the kitchen space, the fireboxes, the counter frames, the floor grade, the ventilation that someone had actually thought about. Then she walked back toward the horses and he followed, and the wind that came off the ridge smelled like pine resin and cold water and something she couldn't name but recognized anyway. It smelled like the beginning of something. The agreement was signed on a Thursday afternoon in the back office of Clara Finch's territorial land building, with Clara herself as witness and a lawyer named Pettigrew, Marlowe's choice, a careful man who'd handled estate work and didn't owe favors to anyone in the merchant district, reading every line twice before he'd let her put her name to it. Gideon sat across the table and waited without fidgeting, which she noticed. Men who were hiding something in a contract tended to fill the silence. He drank the coffee Clara had provided and looked out the window at the street. Paragraph 7, Pettigrew said, pushing his glasses up. The termination clause. 30 days notice on either side is standard, but I'd want to see a provision that any improvements made to the kitchen structure by Miss Quinn remain her property or are compensated at fair market value if she exits. That's fair, Gideon said, without hesitation. Pettigrew wrote it in. Marlowe signed. Gideon signed. Clara witnessed. Pettigrew made 2 copies and blotted them both carefully. Walking out into the afternoon, Marlowe carried her copy folded inside her coat, against her chest. It was a peculiar feeling, not triumph exactly, more like the feeling of ground that had finally stopped shifting underfoot. She'd been on uncertain ground for 6 years. This was something solid. Gideon fell into step beside her on the boardwalk. The framing for the counter installations needs to go in this week, he said. I've got timber coming up Thursday from the Halverson mill. If you want to be there to verify the dimensions before it's cut, I'll be there Wednesday to mark the measurements myself, she said. He glanced at her. You know Finnish carpentry? I know what I need my workspace to do, she said. Whether I swing the hammer myself is a separate question. That was the beginning of it. Not ceremonious, just work. She moved up to the gray spine post at the start of October, 3 weeks after the agreement was signed, in a hired freight wagon loaded with everything she'd accumulated over 6 years of mobile cooking. Her mother's skillet and the rest of the iron cookware she'd bought piece by piece, her preserved goods inventory, the spice collection she'd built with deliberate care, 2 50-pound sacks of good flour, her cot and her storage trunk, and the small shelf of books she carried everywhere. The kitchen took shape over the following 3 weeks, in a way that felt, to Marlowe, like building an argument, everything placed where it was placed for a reason, nothing decorative, nothing wasted. The main firebox went in first, a proper range installation with a damper system that Gideon helped her spec out from a supply catalog, and that a stonemason from Harwick came up to set correctly. The counter space came next, long runs on the north and south walls, the height she'd specified, with the heavy work surface she'd asked for installed at the east end for the most physically demanding prep tasks. She hung her tools in the sequence she reached for them. She built a dry storage arrangement that kept the most used items accessible, and the inventory organized in a system she could manage alone. Gideon worked on the trading room in the mornings and helped her with construction tasks in the afternoons when she needed an extra pair of hands and didn't feel like pretending she didn't. He was competent with tools in the straightforward way of someone who'd spent years in situations where you either learned to fix things or did without. He didn't offer opinions about the kitchen unless she asked for them, and when she asked, he gave them plainly and dropped them if she went a different direction. They developed a working rhythm. It wasn't friendship exactly. It was something more functional than that. A mutual recognition of how the other person operated that made the shared work move better. She learned that he was at his most useful in the early morning before he'd talked much, and that if she needed something discussed, she should raise it over the midday meal, when he was more likely to actually engage rather than just agree. He learned, she thought, whatever the equivalent was about her. The first customers arrived before they'd officially opened. A trapper named Devereaux, rangy and tobacco-stained, showed up one November morning with 3 pack horses loaded with winter pelts, and a look of someone who'd been on the trail for 3 weeks and was experiencing it. He'd heard about the post from another trapper on the north route. "You open?" he said from the porch. "We're not," Gideon said. Marlowe came to the door behind him, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at Devereaux and his horses, and the particular hollow around his eyes that came from too many cold nights and not enough calories. "Come in," she said. "I'll feed you." Gideon looked at her. She gave him a look back that said, "This is not a discussion," and moved aside for Devereaux to pass. She made a working lunch out of what she had. Bean soup from the pot she kept going, cornbread from the morning, cured pork she sliced and pan-fried. It wasn't a finished menu item, it was just food, properly made, hot and real. Devereaux ate without speaking for 5 minutes straight. "Lord above," he finally said, which was not a comment that required response. He paid for the meal, paid fair price for a resupply of dried goods and tobacco from the trading room, and left an hour later. He came back 3 weeks after that with 2 other trappers and a Shoshone trader named Calls at Dusk, who traveled the northern routes and moved between the trapping camps and the native settlements. By December, they had a regular custom. What Marlowe built in that kitchen over the winter months was not a restaurant in any formal sense. It was something more particular to where it was and what the territory needed. She kept the menu simple, rotating daily offerings based on what she had and what the season allowed. Always something hot. Always something that could feed a man who'd been in the cold for days. Prices were set plainly, posted on a board, and didn't change based on who was asking. That last part turned out to matter more than she'd anticipated. The frontier had its own economy of price. What you paid depended on who you were and how desperate you appeared, and the merchants in Harwick and the smaller outpost stores along the main routes were practiced at reading both. Trappers paid more in bad seasons. Settlers new to the territory paid more because they didn't know what anything should cost. Native traders paid more consistently and arbitrarily, because there was no one to tell them they were being cheated, and the people doing the cheating had no particular motivation to stop. At the Grayspine post, the board price was the board price. Calls at Dusk noticed it first. He came in on his 3rd visit with 2 men from his trading network, a Crow trader and a mixed-blood trapper from the Northern Territories, and spent a long time at the trading room counter with Gideon, going through the inventory carefully. When he came through to the kitchen for the meal, he sat at the end of the long table and watched Marlowe work for a while before he said anything. "Same price as the last man," he said. It wasn't a question. "Same price as anyone," Marlowe said, without turning from the stove. A pause. "That's not usual." "No," she agreed. It's not. He thought about that. He ate his meal. He came back the following month with a broader network and information about supply routes through the northern passes that Gideon found useful and had not been able to get from any other source. He didn't explain the connection. He didn't need to. Word moved the way it moved on the frontier, and not through newspapers or formal channels, but through the slow accumulation of small reports carried by people who traveled. A trapper mentioned the post to a settler family on a trail crossing. The settler family mentioned it to the range crew they bought cattle from. The range crew told the next trapper. By February, Marlowe was feeding between 12 and 20 people on a busy day, and the trading room was turning enough volume that Gideon had to reorder supply twice in a month. They hired their first help in March, a 16-year-old named Tomas, who'd been working odd labor at a ranch that had let half its crew go after a bad winter and who showed up at the post asking if there was anything. Marlowe put him to work hauling wood and doing prep, watched him for 2 weeks, and then started teaching him things. He was quick to learn and quiet about it, which she appreciated. "You're teaching him to cook," Gideon observed one evening. "I'm teaching him to work in a kitchen," she said. "There's a difference, and then there isn't." "What's the difference?" "At the start, you teach someone where to stand and what to do with their hands. After a while, if they're paying attention, they start understanding why." She paused, ladling the evening soup into a storage vessel. "Tomas is at the why stage already. He just doesn't know he is." Gideon watched Tomas through the kitchen doorway, where the boy was breaking down the evening prep area with the focused care of someone who'd recently understood that it mattered. "You had someone teach you that way?" "My mother," Marlowe said. "She ran a boarding house kitchen for 20 years. She could feed 40 people out of whatever was available on a Tuesday and make it seem like it had been planned. She always said the skill wasn't in the recipe. It was in the thinking." She put the lid on the storage vessel. She didn't say anything else about it, and he didn't push. Spring brought more traffic. The snow came off the upper passes in late April, and the trails opened back up, and with them came a different kind of traveler. Not just the trappers and traders who'd been moving through the northern routes all winter, but settlers in wagons, whole families in some cases, moving west or moving up into the territory to find land and start something. They came through the post road hungry and tired, and in varying states of hope and discouragement. Marlowe fed them all. She didn't have a policy about it exactly. She didn't sit down and decide in advance how she'd handle a family that clearly couldn't afford the board price. She just handled it when it happened. A different portion size here, a price that was somehow slightly less than listed there, a pot of something that materialized for children without being charged at all. She didn't make a performance of it. Gideon noticed and said nothing, which was the right response. What she was less prepared for was the pushback. It came first from a man named Aldous Crane, who ran the main supply and trade operation in Harwick and had been the dominant merchant serving the northern routes for most of the decade. He arrived at the Gray Spine post on a warm May afternoon in a good coat and a bad mood, with 2 men behind him who had the particular quality of men hired to occupy space in Project Wait. Marlowe was in the kitchen when he came in. She heard his voice from the trading room, loud, with the practiced projection of someone who'd learned that volume was its own form of authority. She finished what she was doing at the stove, wiped her hands, and came out. "Miss Quinn," Crane said, as though he'd known she was coming and had positioned himself accordingly. He was perhaps 50, heavy through the chest, with a careful beard that said he spent time on his appearance and quick eyes that said he spent more time on his calculation. "I've been hoping for an introduction." "Mr. Crane," she said. She knew who he was. Everyone on the northern routes knew who he was. "I'll come directly to the point," he said. "I'm a man who values efficiency. You've built an interesting operation here." "Thank you." "I'd like to discuss a purchasing arrangement," he said. "I represent certain supply interests that can provide better pricing than you're currently getting through the Halverson mill and your Harwick contacts. Significant better pricing. The kind of margin improvement that would allow you to expand." Marlowe looked at him. What would the arrangement look like? He told her. It was, on its surface, reasonable. A supply contract, Crane's network providing flour, dried goods, salt, and tobacco at better-than-market rates. The detail that emerged as he talked, if you were listening carefully, was that the arrangement came with certain understandings. Pricing structures for the trade post that aligned with Crane's existing price points on the route, purchasing limits for native traders that kept them from building the kind of supply relationships that cut merchants like Crane out of the middle, and a courtesy arrangement whereby any unusual activity or traveler intelligence that came through the post would be shared with Crane's network. "What you're describing," Marlowe said when he'd finished, "is for me to raise my prices, limit who I'll sell to, and inform on my customers." Crane smiled, which didn't reach his eyes. "I'd characterize it more as alignment with the existing commercial structure of the territory." "I'm sure you would, Miss Quinn," he said, his voice dropping into a different register, still friendly on the surface, but with something underneath it. "The frontier has a way of becoming very difficult for businesses that operate outside of established relationships. Supply problems, transportation disruptions, rumors that spread in ways nobody quite accounts for." He let that sit for a moment. "I've seen promising operations close for reasons that seemed, on the surface, unrelated to any particular decision they'd made. Is that a threat?" she said. "Or are you genuinely concerned about my well-being?" Something moved behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or a reassessment of something. "It's a business observation," he said. "Then here's mine," Marlowe said. "I'm not going to change my pricing structure or my customer policies. I'm not going to share information about the people who come through here. And I'm not going to enter into an arrangement that's designed to let someone else control how I operate." She met his eyes steadily. "If your supply network is genuinely competitive on price, submit a written bid like anyone else. I'll look at it." Crane looked at her for a long moment. His two men hadn't moved or spoken. "You might want to discuss this with your partner," he said. "I speak for the kitchen operation," Marlowe said. "That's what the agreement says. You're welcome to speak with Mr. Ashcroft about the trading room." Crane glanced toward the back, where Gideon had appeared in the doorway between the trading room and the main space, apparently having found something to look at on the shelving near the passage. He wasn't moving toward the conversation. He was just there. "Another time," Crane said. He put on his hat. He walked out, his two men a step behind him. The door closed. Tomas, who had been very busy at the kitchen counter and had not moved or made a sound for the last several minutes, exhaled. Gideon came the rest of the way through the doorway. "I heard most of that," he said. "I know. You didn't mention it to me first." "There wasn't time," she said, "and it was kitchen business." He was quiet for a moment. She went back to the stove, checking the afternoon's stew. "He wasn't wrong about supply disruptions," Gideon said. "He's got relationships with 3 of the 4 freight contractors that run these routes." "I know that too," she said. "We'll need to develop alternatives. I have some contacts with the Eastern Freight Network. Different ownership. Takes longer, but it's independent." "Then let's start those conversations." He looked at her back. "You're not worried," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm worried," she said. "I'm just not going to let that change the decision." She heard him exhale. Not exasperation, just something released. "All right," he said, and went back to the trading room. The supply disruptions started in June. They were small at first. A delayed shipment of flour that arrived 2 weeks late and short-counted, a tobacco order that came through a different carrier than expected, and at a higher price. Marlowe adapted. She'd built a reserve inventory precisely because she hadn't fully trusted the supply chain, and she started working with the Eastern Freight Network Gideon had identified. Then the rumors started. She heard about them first from Devereaux, who came in on a July afternoon and sat at the far end of the table with the look of a man who'd been deciding whether to say something. "There's talk on the route," he said finally. "About this place." "What kind of talk?" "The kind somebody's spreading." He picked at the edge of his coffee cup. "That the food here makes people sick, that the trading room waits are off, that—" He stopped. "That what?" she said. He looked up. "That you're passing information to the land office. About trap lines. About who's operating where." He held her gaze. "I know that's not true. I'm here telling you because you should know what's being said." Marlowe was quiet for a moment. "Who's sourcing it?" "Nobody says. It's just on the route. The way things are on the route." He paused. 2 crews I know of went to Crane's outpost at Ridgeback instead of coming here this month. I don't know if it's connected. I'm just telling you what I know." She thanked him. She sat with it. That evening, she told Gideon. They were at the table after the kitchen was closed, the post quiet around them, the summer dark coming down early with clouds building from the west. "Crane," Gideon said. "Most likely. We can't prove it." "No," she said. "Not yet." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "There's something I should tell you," he said after a moment, "about Crane, and about a man named Roland Mercer." She looked at him. His face had shifted into something harder and more inward. "Mercer's the territorial magistrate," he said. "Most people know that part. What fewer people know is that Crane's supply network and Mercer's land decisions have been moving in the same direction for a long time. Ranches that run into trouble with Mercer's office tend to find themselves buying supplies from Crane at whatever price Crane sets." He stopped. "I've been watching this for 3 years. I have some documentation. Not enough to take anywhere useful, but enough to see the pattern." "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. He looked at her across the table. "Because a week ago I got a letter," he said. "It came through the land office relay. Unmarked sender. It told me to encourage my partner to reconsider her business practices, or the post would find itself facing certain legal complications regarding the land title." Marlowe was very still. "I didn't tell you right away," he said. "I should have." "Yes," she said. "You should have. I was trying to—" He stopped himself, started again. "I thought I could get ahead of it, find out what the legal issue was supposed to be, whether there was any real ground to it. And I think there might be," he said. "Not in a real sense. The title is clean, I'm certain of that, but in the sense that Mercer's office can create problems with any title in this territory if it decides to. He's done it before." He paused. "He did it to my brother." The words sat in the space between them. Marlowe had heard the reference to his brother before, the past tense of it, and had waited for him to come to it himself. Here it was. "Tell me," she said. He told her. It took a while. His brother had run a small ranch north of Harwick, built it over 5 years, had a wife and 2 young children. Mercer's office had produced a challenge to the land patent on the basis of a survey discrepancy, the kind of discrepancy that existed in dozens of frontier land grants and that Mercer's office typically ignored. They hadn't ignored it in his brother's case. The challenge had run through the territorial court for 2 years. The legal costs had broken the ranch's finances, and in the end the land had been absorbed into a parcel that now sat adjacent to a railroad right-of-way that was worth considerably more with the acreage attached. His brother had moved his family to Colorado 3 years ago. Gideon hadn't seen him since. He had documents, Gideon said. Correspondence, survey records, payment receipts. He gave them to me before he left because he didn't want to carry them, and he thought maybe someday— He didn't finish the sentence. "Where are they?" Marlowe said. "Locked box," he said. "In my room." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the first distant rumble of the incoming storm moved through the mountains. "We need to know more about the pattern," she said. "Not just your brother's case. If Mercer has been doing this across the territory, there will be others, other families, other records." "That's a lot of digging," Gideon said. "Then we'd better start," she said. He looked at her across the table, and something shifted in the line of his jaw. Not quite relief, but something adjacent to it. The particular release of a man who'd been carrying something alone for too long and had finally handed part of it to someone capable of holding it. The storm broke over the ridge then, rain coming hard and fast against the windows, and the lamps in the kitchen swayed with the draft under the door. Marlowe got up and wedged the door, checked the kitchen fire, made sure the covers were on the outdoor supply. She moved through the post in the storm's noise with the practical calm of someone who'd weathered a lot of things and expected to weather more. When she came back to the table, Gideon had gotten out a piece of paper and was writing names. The families Mercer's office had moved against, the properties, the dates. She sat down and looked at the list. It was longer than she'd expected. The list had 14 names on it by the time Gideon set down his pen. Marlowe read through them twice. Some she recognized. The Halverson name was there, the same family that ran the mill that supplied their timber. And she thought about the careful, quiet way old Halverson had handled their transactions, the way he never extended more credit than he could absorb, the way he'd mentioned once, offhandedly, that he kept his land papers in a bank box in Cheyenne rather than locally. Now she understood why. Others on the list were strangers, family names attached to land parcels in areas she didn't know, dates ranging back 7 years. These are just the ones I know about, Gideon said, from my brother's contacts and what I've pieced together since. There are more. Almost certainly. She folded the paper carefully and set it on the table between them. The rain was still coming hard outside, drumming against the roof of the secondary structure, running off the covered walkway in a steady curtain. The lamp between them threw uneven light across Gideon's face, catching the lines around his eyes that she'd stopped noticing individually somewhere in the winter months. They were just part of how he looked now, the way everything familiar eventually stops announcing itself. The letter that came through the land office, she said. You still have it? Yes. That's a document, she said. That's the beginning of a paper trail if we need one. It's unsigned. Unsigned letters still have to come from somewhere. They go through relay stations. Someone handles them. She looked at him. Clara Finch runs the Territorial Land Office. Clara Finch is a careful woman, Gideon said. She does her job correctly, and she doesn't involve herself in things she can't control. No, Marlowe said, but she's also the person who organized the competition where I won this contract, and she noticed my fire management, and she was the one who said good work today before the results were announced. She noticed things. She paused. Careful people who notice things are sometimes exactly who you need. Gideon was quiet for a moment. I don't want to put her in a difficult position. We're not going to ask her to do anything, Marlowe said. We're going to ask her what she knows. There's a difference. He looked at her across the lamp. You always do that. Do what? Find the exact line between the thing that's possible and the thing that isn't, and stand on it. She wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an observation or something else. Somebody has to, she said. Dad. They rode to Harwick the following week, on a morning that had cleared after the storm and left the mountain air sharp and clean and smelling of wet pine. Marlowe had written to Clara Finch 3 days before, a brief, careful letter that said she had some questions about land record procedures in the territory and would appreciate 20 minutes of her time. Nothing alarming in it, nothing that would make a recipient with Mercer's kind of reach for the letter before Clara did. Clara received them in her office, which was a spare organized room at the back of the Territorial Land Building, maps on the walls, filing systems that made sense, a desk that held exactly what was currently relevant and nothing else. She was perhaps 55 with gray at her temples and the kind of posture that came from decades of being the most organized person in every room she entered. She looked at them both when they came in, then looked at the door she'd just closed behind them. This isn't about land record procedures, she said. No, Marlowe agreed. Clara sat down behind her desk. Sit down, both of you. They sat. Gideon had the paper with the 14 names. He set it on the desk without comment. Clara looked at it for a long time without touching it. Where did you get this? She said. My brother's records, Gideon said, and what I've collected since. There are more than 14, Clara said. The room was very quiet. How many more? Marlowe said. Clara looked up from the list. Her expression was not quite what Marlowe expected. Not surprise, not distress, but rather the particular look of someone who had been sitting with something heavy for a long time and had just seen it named out loud for the first time. Relief and dread in equal proportion. I've been documenting irregularities in the land patent challenges for 4 years, Clara said. Quietly. In my own records, not in any official file that goes through Mercer's review process. She paused. 23 cases in this territory alone, possibly more that I haven't been able to connect definitively. Gideon's jaw tightened. Marlowe watched him absorb that number, watched it move through him, the way information does when it's worse than what you'd prepared for. The pattern is consistent, Clara continued. A survey discrepancy is identified, always legitimate in the narrow technical sense, always the kind of thing that exists in dozens of other patents that are never challenged. The challenge runs through the territorial court. The legal process is slow and expensive. The family either pays or loses, and the land in question ends up associated with a parcel that benefits from railroad adjacency, or mineral rights, or both. She folded her hands on the desk. Roland Mercer has a financial interest in 3 land holding companies operating in this territory. That interest is not disclosed anywhere in his official capacity. I have documentation of it. Clara, Gideon said carefully, why haven't you taken this anywhere? She looked at him with an expression that was almost impatient. Where would I take it, Gideon? Mercer's office oversees the territorial court appointment process. The federal land commissioner who has jurisdiction over his conduct is in Cheyenne and has been to this territory exactly twice in 10 years, both times as a guest of the railroad. I'm a woman running a land records office in a territory where women aren't supposed to run anything, and I have documentation of criminal conduct by the most powerful official in the region. She paused. I've been waiting for the right moment and the right combination of factors, not out of cowardice, out of arithmetic. What factors? Marlowe said. Enough documented cases to make the pattern undeniable, Clara said. Enough witnesses who would speak publicly, and someone willing to be the point of confrontation, because whoever forces this into the open will be the first target. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when everyone in a room understands simultaneously what is being said without anyone having said it yet. The eviction notice, Marlowe said. Is that what comes next? For us. Clara reached into her desk drawer and produced an envelope. She set it on the desk between them. This arrived at my office 4 days ago, she said. Filed through the territorial court. It's a preliminary notice of land patent challenge for the Gray Spine Post property based on a survey line discrepancy in the original filing. Gideon picked up the envelope. Marlowe watched his hands. They were steady, but something had gone rigid in his shoulders. 4 days, he said. I waited because I needed to know if you already knew, Clara said, and because I needed to decide whether to tell you at all, which would mean involving myself in a way I can't take back. And you decided, Marlowe said. You came to my office, Clara said, which saved me from having to come to yours. The notice gave them 60 days to respond. 60 days sounded like time. Marlowe knew better. 60 days in a legal process run by the people who'd filed the challenge wasn't time. It was the appearance of time, the formal shape of due process arranged around an outcome that had already been decided. She'd seen it before, in a different form, in a different territory, when her mother's boarding house had been taken. The papers had a legitimate face. The face was not the point. She said this to Gideon on the ride back, straight out. The way she'd learned was the only useful way to say things to him. I know, he said. He was quiet for a moment, the horses moving north through the afternoon light. We have 2 options as I see it. We respond to the challenge through the court process and spend the next year fighting something designed to be unfightable. Or we find a way to bring this into the open before it gets to the court. There's a 3rd option, Marlowe said. He looked at her. We could leave, she said. She wanted to say it plainly because she needed him to understand she'd considered it and set it aside deliberately, not out of stubbornness. Take what we've built, find another location, start over somewhere Mercer's reach doesn't extend. Gideon was quiet. That's what my brother did. Yes, she said. I know. He turned back to the trail. What's the 3rd option? I just told you. We could leave. I said there were 3, but that one's off the table. He looked at her again, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it did when he was suppressing something. She'd come to recognize that, the slight shift at the edge of his jaw that was as close to a wry expression as his face usually produced. So 2 options, he said. 2 options. They rode in silence for a mile. Bringing it into the open means getting people to speak publicly, Gideon said. The families on Clara's list, the traders, the trappers, the people who've been through Mercer's process. Some of them have moved on. Some of them are afraid. Some of them eat in my kitchen 3 times a week, Marlowe said. He thought about that. The Gray Spine Post. People trust what happens there, she said, because of how we've operated, because of the price board and the way we've treated the traders and the fact that Devereaux and Calls at Dusk and the Halverson family and 24 others know that we don't work the way Crane works. She paused. That trust is the only leverage we actually have. Not Clara's documents alone. Those can be buried or contested or delayed for years. But testimony from people who the community trusts, given publicly, in front of witnesses who can't all be silenced at once. Mercer will know what we're doing before we finish setting it up, Gideon said. He'll have people watching. Yes, she said. He will? And if he moves before we're ready, then we deal with that when it happens. He was quiet again. The ridge came into view ahead of them, the gray granite of the outcropping catching the late afternoon light. You want to call a gathering, he said. At the post. Not just a gathering, she said. Something public enough that shutting it down would cost them more than letting it happen. They had 3 weeks before they were ready. It wasn't enough time, but it was what they had, and Marlowe had spent enough years working with whatever was available to know that waiting for sufficient time was the same as not starting. She sent word through every channel she could reach. Devereaux carried letters north along the trapping routes. Calls at dusk, who understood the situation more fully than Marlowe had explained and drew his own conclusions, took word through the native trading network. Tomas, who had turned out to have a directness and reliability that exceeded his 16 years, rode south to the Halverson Mill and to 2 settler families along the post road who told Marlowe things about their experiences with the land office over winter meals at the kitchen table. Gideon wrote to 6 men he'd worked with during his years as a territorial ranger. Men who'd seen things and knew things and had been sitting on their knowledge with the particular discomfort of people who'd witnessed wrongdoing without a clear place to take it. Marlowe wrote to Clara Finch. The letter was short. It said, "We're ready when you are. Bring what you have." Clara wrote back in 2 days. "I'll be there." The interference started in the second week. 2 freight shipments went missing, not delayed, actually missing, the carriers claiming they'd delivered to the wrong relay point, which was the kind of explanation that couldn't be disproved and wasn't meant to be. A letter Marlowe had sent to a settler family named Pruitt came back unopened with a notation that the addressee had moved, which Marlowe knew was false because she'd spoken to Rebecca Pruitt 10 days earlier. Someone had intercepted it. Then Devereaux came back from the northern route early with a bruised cheekbone and a careful expression. 2 men on the trail north of Ridgeback, he said, asked me where I'd been and where I was going. When I didn't answer the way they wanted, they got specific about it. Marlowe looked at his face. "Are you all right?" "I've had worse." He paused. "I want to be clear about something. Whatever you're doing, I'm in. Not because of this." He gestured vaguely at his cheekbone. "Because of the 2 years of fair dealing at this post. I want to be clear, that's the reason." "I understand," she said. "Thank you." She told Gideon that evening. He listened with his jaw set. "Crane's men, probably," he said. "Or Mercer's. At this point, the distinction barely matters." He paused. "We're getting close to the point where they decide it's cheaper to shut us down physically than to wait for the legal process." "I know," she said. "How many of your ranger contacts have confirmed?" 4 out of 6. 2 I haven't heard from." 4 is enough. Marlowe." He stopped. Started again, differently. "I want you to know that if this goes wrong, if we miscalculate how far they're willing to go, I have no intention of letting you take that alone." She looked at him. It was a simple statement, and he'd delivered it simply, without weight or performance, the way he said most things that mattered to him. She'd come to understand that was how he was, that the absence of drama was not the absence of meaning. "I know that," she said, which was also simple and also true. The morning of the gathering was the 3rd Saturday in August. People began arriving at the Gray Spine post before sunrise. The Halverson family came first, old Halverson himself, his 2 grown sons, and a man Marlowe didn't know who turned out to be a surveyor Halverson had worked with 30 years before and who had his own records of the survey methodology used in the territory during the period when Mercer's first challenges had been filed. They came in a wagon and unloaded a locked box of papers with the careful deliberateness of people who had waited a long time for a place to put something down. Calls at dusk arrived before 8, with 7 people from the Northern Trading Network, native elders and mixed-blood traders who traveled routes that crossed every major land dispute in the territory and who had watched the pattern Marlowe and Gideon had documented from angles the documentation didn't capture. They carried their own witness in the form of long memory and specific detail. The settler families came through the morning. The Pruitts, a family named Garfield who'd been fighting a patent challenge for 18 months, 3 other families whose names Marlowe had seen on Clara's list, and who came in wagons with children and dogs, and the particular posture of people who had nothing left to lose by speaking. Gideon's ranger contacts were already there when most of the others arrived, having ridden through the night. They were lean, weathered men who said little and positioned themselves in ways that suggested long habit of knowing where the exits were. They weren't there to fight. They were there because Gideon had asked, and because they trusted Gideon's judgment the way you trust the judgment of someone who has been right enough times in difficult situations to have earned it. Clara Finch arrived at 9 in a territorial land office wagon with 2 locked document cases and a man Marlowe didn't recognize. "Who is that?" Gideon said quietly, watching from the porch. "I don't know." Clara came up the steps and introduced him. "This is James Whitmore. He's a federal land commissioner. He arrived in Harwick 2 days ago." She paused. He'd already received a separate complaint about irregularities in Mercer's patent challenge process, filed 3 months ago by a former territorial court clerk who left the territory. She let that sit for a moment. "He came to me because my office maintains the records." Whitmore was perhaps 40, with the formal bearing of a government man and the eyes of someone who'd been in enough territorial disputes to have stopped being surprised by them. He shook Marlowe's hand, then Gideon's. "I want to be clear about my position," he said. "I'm here in a listening capacity. I can't make promises about outcomes. What I can say is that testimony given today in front of this many witnesses becomes part of a federal record that my office controls rather than the territorial court. That's what Clara asked me to come for." "That's enough," Marlowe said. By mid-morning, there were more than 40 people on the grounds of the Gray Spine Post. Marlowe had set up the long tables from the kitchen outside on the south side of the building, in the open air with the granite outcropping behind them and the morning sky above. She'd put food out, not a formal meal, but the kind of sustained provision that kept people present and fed through a long, difficult day. Coffee, bread, preserved fruit from the kitchen stores, a pot of something hot that Tomas managed without being asked. She stood at the edge of the gathering and looked at the faces. 40-some people who'd come because a letter found them or a word of mouth reached them, who'd traveled in some cases 2 days for the chance to say what they knew in front of a federal official. She thought about the list of 14 names that Gideon had written on a rainy night in the kitchen, 23 that Clara had documented, however many more that were still out there, unconnected, sitting in the memory of people who hadn't known there was anywhere to bring them. Gideon appeared at her shoulder. "Mercer knows," he said quietly. "I had word from one of the ranger contacts an hour ago. A rider went south toward Harwick about 90 minutes before sunup. She'd expected this." "How long before he responds?" "He's 6 hours from here if he rides directly." "Then we have 6 hours." "Marlowe." His voice was low and very even. "When he gets here, he won't come alone." "I know." "I need you to understand what that might look like." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the particular focused attention he used when he needed to know where she actually was. Not where she was performing, not where she was supposed to be, but where she actually was. "I understand what it might look like," she said. "I've understood that since the night we read that list." She held his gaze. "The question isn't whether I'm afraid. The question is whether what we're doing here is worth the fear." He was quiet for a moment. "Is it?" he said. Not a challenge. A genuine question, asked of the person whose answer he trusted. She looked out at the gathered people. The Halverson sons helping an elderly Pruitt woman find a seat. Calls at dusk standing with the federal commissioner in what appeared to be a detailed and serious conversation. Devereaux in his bruised cheek talking to one of the ranger contacts. Clara Finch opening her document cases at one of the tables with the calm precision of someone who had been waiting 4 years to open them in the right place. "Yes," she said. "It is." She walked to the center of the gathering and raised her voice. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know some of you traveled a long way. I know some of you are taking a risk by being here." She paused, looking around at the faces. "What we're going to do today is simple. We're going to tell the truth, as much of it as we know, in front of a federal official who has the authority to receive it. We're going to do it in front of each other, so there are too many witnesses to silence, and we're going to do it today, because some of us have been waiting long enough." Nobody spoke. 40 people on the grounds of a mountain trading post in the August morning listening. "Who wants to start?" she said. Old Halverson raised his hand. He stood up slowly, with the careful movement of a man whose joints had opinions about cold weather, and he began to talk. His voice was rough and unhurried, and what came out of it was 7 years of specific, documented memory. Dates and survey numbers and names and the particular transaction through which the land adjacent to his mill had ended up, after a 2-year patent challenge, in a holding company he'd later traced through 3 layers of paper to Roland Mercer's financial interests. He talked for 20 minutes. When he sat down, the Garfield family's oldest daughter stood up without being asked. She was perhaps 25, with the kind of quiet anger that comes from having been articulate about injustice for a long time in rooms where nobody was listening. She talked for 15 minutes about her family's 18-month challenge and the way the court process had worked, the delays, the costs, the way every procedural motion seemed to arrive at just the moment when the family's resources were lowest. Then a Crow elder from Calls at Dusk's network stood and spoke in his own language, with Calls at Dusk translating, about the trading routes that had been disrupted when particular land parcels had changed hands, about the pattern of whose land ended up being affected and whose never was. Whitmore, the federal commissioner, sat at a table with a ledger open in front of him and wrote steadily. He asked questions, careful, specific, procedural questions that revealed a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. Clara Finch produced documents at intervals to support what witnesses were saying, setting them on the table in front of him with the ordered efficiency of someone who had organized them specifically for this moment. The morning moved into afternoon. The food on the tables went down, and Tomas replenished it without interrupting anything. People talked and were heard and sat back down, and the federal ledger filled with pages. Marlowe moved through the gathering, listening, watching the road. At 4 in the afternoon, she saw the dust rising on the southern approach. She put her hand on Gideon's arm. He looked where she was looking. "That's more than 2 riders," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She walked back to the center of the gathering. "There are riders coming from the south," she said, loud enough for the group. "I expect it's Roland Mercer. I want everyone to know that you are free to leave if you choose to. The federal commissioner has your testimony already in his record. Nobody here is obligated to stay." Nobody moved. She looked out at 40 faces, tired people, frightened people, angry people, people who'd been waiting a very long time for a moment exactly like this one. Nobody was leaving. "All right," she said. She turned to face the road. The riders came up the post road at a pace that was meant to be seen, a deliberate, unhurried approach that communicated certainty. There were 8 of them. Roland Mercer rode at the front, which Marlowe had not quite expected. She'd thought he might send representatives. But here he was in person, which told her something about how seriously he was taking this, and how confident he was in his ability to end it. He was a compact man, perhaps 60, well-dressed for the frontier. Good coat, clean boots, the particular groomed authority of someone who had operated with impunity for long enough that it had become part of how he carried himself. 7 deputies or hired men rode behind him. He pulled up at the edge of the gathering and looked at the assembled people with an expression that started as contempt and shifted, almost imperceptibly, into something else as he counted the faces. "This is an illegal assembly," he said. His voice projected well, practiced at this. "You are on land under active patent challenge, and you are interfering with a territorial court proceeding." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Mercer's eyes moved across the group and found James Whitmore sitting at his table with his ledger open. Something changed in Mercer's face, a rapid recalculation, invisible to anyone not watching carefully. Marlowe was watching carefully. "Mr. Mercer," she said from the center of the gathering. He looked at her. "You're welcome to dismount and join us," she said. "There's food, and the federal commissioner has been taking testimony all day. I'm sure he'd be interested in hearing your account as well." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a moment in which everything that happens next is still being decided. Mercer sat on his horse and looked at her and at the 40 people around her, and at the federal commissioner with his ledger, and at Gideon Ashcroft standing 8 feet to Marlowe's left, with his arms at his sides and the ranger contacts positioned in the loose, observant way of men who were not pointing weapons at anyone and also were not people you wanted to make a sudden move around. One of the deputies behind Mercer shifted his horse. One of the Halverson sons, on the far side of the gathering, stood up from where he'd been sitting. "Don't," Gideon said to the deputy. Quietly, precisely. The deputy's horse settled. Mercer looked at Whitmore again. Whitmore looked back at him with the expression of a federal official who had been writing in a ledger all day and was going to continue writing in a ledger regardless of what happened in the next 5 minutes. The calculation on Mercer's face was visible, if you were looking for it. Too many witnesses. A federal record already made. Violence in front of a sitting land commissioner. "This isn't finished," Mercer said. "No," Marlowe agreed. "It isn't." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned his horse, and the deputies turned with him, and they rode back down the post road the way they'd come, at the same deliberate, unhurried pace. Nobody cheered. Nobody exhaled dramatically. The gathering held its shape, watching the dust settle back over the road, and then slowly people began to turn back to each other, to the tables, to the work of the afternoon that wasn't done yet. Whitmore looked up from his ledger. "I'll need another hour," he said. "There are 3 witnesses I haven't gotten to." "Take what you need," Marlowe said. She walked back to the kitchen and stood inside it for a moment alone, in the quiet, familiar space of her own building, her hands braced on the counter she'd built the way she wanted it. Her heart was moving faster than it had any business moving. Her hands were not shaking, but they wanted to. She let herself have a moment of that. Just a moment. Then she pushed off the counter and went back outside to where 40 people were still gathered in the August light, still talking, still waiting to be heard. Whitmore stayed until the light failed. He worked through the remaining witnesses with the same methodical patience he'd maintained all day. Specific questions, careful notation, the occasional request to repeat a date or clarify a name, the kind of focused attention that told Marlowe he understood what he was sitting in the middle of and was not going to waste it. When the last witness sat back down and the last document had been examined and entered into his record, he closed the ledger and held it with both hands for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then he looked at Clara Finch. "How long have you been building this?" 4 years, Clara said. He was quiet. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite regret, but was in that neighborhood. "You should have had a way to bring this forward sooner." "Yes," Clara said evenly. "I should have." He didn't push on it, which was probably wise. He looked at Marlowe. "I want to be honest with you about what comes next, because I think you've earned honesty about it. What I have in this ledger is substantial. The documentary evidence Miss Finch has provided, combined with the witness testimony and the financial records Mr. Ashcroft produced, it's enough to open a federal investigation into Mercer's conduct. More than enough." "But," Marlowe said, "but a federal investigation takes time. Mercer will be informed that one has been opened. He'll have access to legal counsel and to whatever political relationships he's built over the years, and men in his position tend to have built more than you'd expect." Whitmore set the ledger on the table. "The patent challenge against this property will be suspended pending the investigation. I can issue that order tonight, and it carries federal authority that the territorial court can't override. But the broader resolution, the full accountability for everything documented today, that's months, possibly longer." Marlowe had expected this. She'd made herself expect it over the past weeks because the alternative was counting on a clean ending, and she'd stopped believing in clean endings sometime around the age of 23. "The suspension is enough for now," she said. "The challenge was the weapon pointed at this post. If that's suspended, Mercer loses his leverage over you specifically. Yes." Whitmore paused. "He'll look for other pressure points. I want you to understand that. I understand it. You should also understand that your testimony and Mr. Ashcroft's and the documentation you've provided are now part of a federal record. That provides some protection. It also makes you a more visible target in certain respects." He looked at her directly. "I'm not saying this to frighten you. I'm saying it because you've clearly been operating with clear eyes about this situation, and I'd rather add to that than take from it." "Appreciated," she said. He left an hour later with Clara and her document cases in the Territorial Land Office wagon. Before he climbed up, he stopped and turned back to Marlowe, who was standing on the porch. "The cooking competition," he said. "The one where you won the contract for this post. I read about it in the Territorial Bulletin when it was announced." She wasn't sure where he was going with this. "Yes." "The judge who made the public remark," he said, "before the judging." "Mr. Ashcroft," she said. "I know who he is now." A pause. "He made a significant error." "He did," Marlowe said. "He also acknowledged it directly and did something about it." Whitmore considered that. "That's a rarer combination than it should be." He climbed up onto the wagon seat. "Good night, Miss Quinn." "Good night, Mr. Whitmore." She watched the wagon move down the post road in the dark, lantern swinging until the road bent south and the light disappeared behind the trees. The gathering dispersed over the following hour. Families loaded their wagons. The ranger contacts rode out in pairs, heading back along their various routes. Devereaux shook Marlowe's hand at the door and held it for a moment with both of his, a gesture she hadn't expected from him, and that moved her more than she showed. Calls at Dusk stopped on his way out and looked at her for a moment without speaking, and what passed between them in that look was not translatable into words and didn't need to be. The Halverson family was the last to leave. Old Halverson stood at his wagon with his hat in his hands, not quite ready to go, and finally said what he'd been working up to for the past 10 minutes. "My mill," he said. "The timber supply contract for this post. I want to extend it. 5-year term. Same rate we've been doing." Marlowe looked at him. "We were happy with the arrangement as it was." "I know," he said. "I want 5 years. In writing." She understood what he was saying. It wasn't about timber pricing. It was about putting his name on a document that said he expected this post to be here in 5 years, and that he was willing to stake something on it. "I'll have Pettigrew draw it up," she said. He nodded and got in his wagon, and his sons drove him down the road. And then the grounds were empty and quiet, just the horses in the stable and the lamp still burning in the kitchen and the August dark around the granite outcropping. Thomas had cleaned the outdoor tables and brought everything back inside and was finishing the kitchen closure with the quiet efficiency that had become his signature. He didn't say much when Marlowe came in. He looked at her once, briefly, to confirm she was all right, and then went back to work, which was exactly what she needed. Gideon found her in the kitchen 20 minutes later. He looked tired in a way she didn't see from him often. Not physical tiredness, but the deeper kind that comes after sustained alertness finally releases. He sat down at the work table, and she poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot Tomas had kept going all day. And she put one in front of him and kept one for herself, and they sat without speaking for a while. "He'll come back at us," Gideon said finally. Mercer. "Yes. Not directly. He's too careful for direct, now that there's a federal record." He turned his coffee cup. "He'll find the edges. Something we can't trace back to him." "Probably," she said. "But the people who came today, the Halverson family, the Pruitts, Calls at Dusk's network, they know what happened here. They know what we're dealing with. That's not nothing." "No," he said. "It's not." Tomas said goodnight and went to his room. The kitchen settled into its nighttime quiet. The fire banked low. The lamps turned down. "Your brother," Marlowe said, after a while. Gideon looked at her. "What he gave you before he left," she said. "Those documents, they were in the record today." "Yes." "He didn't know it would come to this." "No," Gideon said. "He was just trying not to carry it anymore." She looked at the surface of her coffee. "You should write to him," she said. "Tell him what happened today." A long pause. "It's not over." "No, but he should know there are people fighting it." She glanced up. "He should know someone used his records, that they mattered." Gideon was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she thought he might not respond. Then, "I'll write tomorrow." She nodded. They finished their coffee in the kind of silence that had, over the past 10 months, become the most honest form of communication available to them. September came in cooler than the year before, and the post-road traffic increased the way it did every fall. People moving before the mountain passes closed, traders making final runs, trapping crews heading to their winter grounds. The Grayspine Post handled it. Marlowe hired a second kitchen hand, a woman named Ida Stroud who'd been cooking for a mining camp operation that had shut down and who needed no training in the fundamentals and only modest direction about how things ran in Marlowe's kitchen specifically. She was 42 and efficient and had approximately 0 patience for drama, which made her an excellent fit. The suspension of the patent challenge had been posted in the territorial bulletin, and people noticed it. Not everyone understood what it meant. The legal language of federal orders was not widely parsed on the frontier, but enough people in enough key positions understood that the Grayspine Post had gone head-to-head with Roland Mercer's land office machinery and had come out the other side still standing. The effect of that on the Post's reputation was subtle but real. The way the reputation of a person who's been tested tends to carry differently than the reputation of someone who hasn't been. Crane came back in the second week of September. Marlowe was in the kitchen when she heard his voice in the trading room. She'd have known it in a crowded market, the particular projection of it, the practiced friendliness that was always doing something else. She didn't go out immediately. She finished the task she was on, plated it, passed it to Ida, and then went to the doorway. Crane was at the counter, speaking to Gideon in the same affable tone he'd used the first time he'd come. His two men were with him again. He looked superficially unchanged. Same careful beard, same good coat, same quick eyes. But there was something different in how he was standing, a slight adjustment in how much space he was taking up. That told Marlowe the calculation had shifted. "Miss Quinn," he said when he saw her, "I was hoping you'd be here." "Mr. Crane," she said. "I wanted to offer my congratulations," he said, with a smile that was not warm. "On the federal matter. That was a remarkable piece of organizing. Thank you." "It must be a relief," he said, "to have the patent question settled. For now." He let the last two words land with their full weight and then moved on smoothly. "I've been giving thought to my previous proposal, the supply arrangement." "I remember the proposal," she said. "I've revised my thinking," he said. "Some of the conditions I'd outlined previously were overspecified. I think there's a simpler arrangement that would benefit both parties." He paused. "Competitive pricing on your core supply needs. No conditions on pricing or customer policy. Just a commercial relationship." Marlowe looked at him. He was watching her with the particular patience of a man who believed he was negotiating and had not yet understood that the negotiation was over. "What changed?" she said. "Pardon?" "3 months ago you came in here and told me the frontier had a way of becoming difficult for businesses that operated outside of established relationships," she said. "Now you're offering a clean supply arrangement with no conditions. What changed?" A beat. Something shifted behind his eyes. "Business conditions evolve," he said. "They do," she agreed. "Particularly when a federal investigation opens into the people those conditions depended on." She held his gaze. "I'm going to say the same thing I said the last time. If your pricing is genuinely competitive, submit a written bid. I'll look at it." She paused. "But you should know that the Eastern freight network we've been using has been reliable and fairly priced, and the relationship is in good shape. I don't have a particular motivation to change." Crane's smile stayed in place, which took some effort that she could see from where she was standing. "Of course," he said. "Think it over." "I will," she said, in the tone that meant she wouldn't. He left, and the room was better for it. Gideon came to the kitchen doorway afterward. "He's getting smaller," he said. "He's repositioning," she said. "He's not gone." "No, but he's scared, which is different from dangerous." He paused. "Or at least differently dangerous." "Watch the freight deliveries through October," she said. "I want to know if there are any more irregularities." "Already planned to." The letter from Gideon's brother arrived on a Thursday morning at the end of September, routed through the Territorial Land Office relay. Gideon read it at the kitchen table before the morning's business started, while Marlowe was doing prep and Ida was starting the first fires. He didn't say anything when he finished reading. He folded the letter and set it on the table and picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the morning light on the granite outcropping. Marlowe didn't push. She continued her prep. After 10 minutes, without turning around, she said, "What did he say?" A long pause. "He said he'd been following the federal case through the bulletin. A friend in Colorado sends him the territorial bulletins." Another pause. He said he'd thought for 3 years that leaving was the only thing that made sense, that there was nothing to do against people like Mercer except get out of the way. And now, he's not sure anymore. Gideon was quiet. He asked if we needed help. He knows surveyors in Colorado who worked the Wyoming Territory in the early period, pre-Mercer, people who might have records of the original surveys before the discrepancies appeared. Marlowe turned around. Gideon was still looking out the window, his hands around his coffee cup, his face doing the careful, controlled thing it did when something had moved him more than he intended to show. "Right back today," she said. "Tell him yes." He looked at her. "We might not need it." "We might," she said, "and either way, he needs to feel useful. He needs to know that what happened to him is connected to something larger than just bad luck." She held his gaze. "Right back today." He nodded. He did. October brought the first hard frost, and with it the particular clarifying quality of cold season frontier life, where everything unnecessary falls away and what remains is what you actually depend on. The kitchen ran full on most days. Ida had found her rhythm in the space completely and had begun, without comment, to adjust and improve certain processes in ways that Marlowe recognized as the work of someone who genuinely understood what they were doing and started owning it. She let her. That was how it was supposed to work. Tomas, who had been studying everything available to him with the focused hunger of a young person who understood that knowledge was the most transportable asset, asked Marlowe one October evening if she thought he could run a kitchen on his own someday. "You could probably run one now," she said. He looked at her with the expression of someone who'd wanted to hear that and hadn't quite believed they would. "Not a large one," she said, "and not without making some significant mistakes first. But the thinking is there. You know why things work, not just how." She paused. "The mistakes are part of it. Don't try to skip them." He thought about that seriously, which she liked about him. How do you know when a mistake is just a mistake and when it's the thing that ends everything? It was a more substantial question than she'd expected from a 16-year-old on a Thursday evening. She considered it honestly. "You mostly don't know in advance," she said. "You make the best decision you can with what you have. Sometimes it goes wrong anyway." She went back to what she was doing. "But the worst mistakes I've seen weren't from people who tried something and failed. They were from people who didn't try anything because they were afraid of failing." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you called the gathering? Even though Mercer showed up with all those men?" "That's part of it," she said. "Were you scared?" She looked up from her work. "Yes," she said. "I was scared the whole day. I was scared when he rode up the road." She paused. "Being scared is fine. It's information. It tells you the thing you're doing matters." She turned back to the stove. "What you do with the information is the part that counts." Tomas absorbed this in his characteristic way, quietly and completely, like a stone taking in water. The federal investigation's first formal findings arrived in the Territorial Bulletin in the third week of October. Marlowe read the notice 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly, then passed it to Gideon without comment. He read it. His expression didn't change dramatically. He'd trained himself out of dramatic reactions over many years of situations that required level heads. But something settled in his face that had been unresolved for a long time. The findings were preliminary and formal in the dense language of federal legal process. But the meaning was clear enough. Roland Mercer had been suspended from his position as territorial magistrate pending full investigation. A federal court auditor had been appointed to review the patent challenge process for the prior 7 years. All pending patent challenges originating from Mercer's office were suspended indefinitely. 23 families, by Clara's count, possibly more. "It's not finished," Gideon said. He'd said this before, and he was right to keep saying it. The investigation would grind on, the legal process would be slow, Mercer would fight every step. "No," Marlowe said. But it started. She thought about this boarding house her mother had built, the kitchen she'd grown up in, the 20 years of work her cousins had stripped and sold in a bad week. She thought about standing in front of Gideon Ashcroft at a competition and choosing not to shrink when he'd made his joke. She thought about the agreement she'd signed at Clara Finch's office, her name in block letters, and the kitchen she'd built on the Gray Spine Ridge, exactly the way it needed to be. None of it had gone smoothly. There had been no moment where the hard part ended and the easy part began. It had been one long, continuous hard part, with different faces. Crane and his conditions, the supply disruptions, Devereaux's bruised cheekbone, the patent notice in Clara's envelope. Mercer on his horse at the edge of the gathering, with 7 men behind him, and the particular confidence of someone who had never had to back down from anything. He'd backed down. Not because she'd been stronger than him in any conventional sense. She wasn't. And he had more resources and more reach and more of the institutional machinery working in his favor than she'd had working in hers. He'd backed down because there had been 40 people standing in the daylight on the grounds of her post and a federal official writing in a ledger. And because the trust she'd built through 2 years of fair dealing and straight pricing and feeding people without calculating their worth first had turned out, in the moment it mattered most, to be worth something that guns and deputies and legal notices couldn't easily counter. That wasn't a neat lesson. It didn't resolve into a clean principle. It was just what had happened, and it had been harder and more uncertain than she would have wanted, and she had been frightened more often than she would have liked, and some things had gone wrong that she hadn't recovered from gracefully. But it had happened. She folded the bulletin and set it on the kitchen counter, and went back to the preparation for the evening meal, because there were people coming who needed to be fed and the fire needed managing, and the day wasn't close to over yet. Gideon was still at the work table when she passed him, looking at the folded bulletin. He looked up. "Your brother's surveyor contacts," he said. "Two of them have written to Whitmore's office directly. Clara told me this morning." "Good," Marlowe said. "It helps the case," he said. "The pre-Mercer survey records could establish the original lines definitively. It might make the difference for some of the families that are still in dispute." "I know," she said. "Is there something else?" He looked at her. "No," he said. "I just wanted to tell you." She nodded and kept moving, and the kitchen filled with the smell of the evening's work. And outside the window, the light on the granite outcropping was going the particular amber of deep October afternoon. And somewhere on the post road below, early arrivals were making their way up through the cold toward a place where the fire was burning and the food was honest, and the price on the board was the price for everyone who walked through the door. That was what she'd built. It wasn't finished, and it wasn't safe, and she didn't know what the next hard thing would be or when it would come. But it was real, and it was hers, and it was still standing. The full investigation ran 7 months. Marlowe knew it would be long. She'd prepared herself for long. What she hadn't quite prepared for was the particular quality of those 7 months. Not dramatic, not punctuated by clear moments of progress or setback, but slow and grinding and bureaucratic in a way that the frontier rarely was. Federal process moved at federal pace. Indifferent to seasons and supply schedules and the daily work of people whose lives depended on outcomes that the government recorded in ledgers and reviewed at intervals that suited no one's urgency but its own. She kept the kitchen running. That was what she could control, and she controlled it with the same attention she'd always brought. The fire management, the pricing board, the supply inventory, the particular calibration of what she offered on any given day against what the season made available and what the people coming through the door actually needed. Ida had become, without any formal announcement of the fact, a genuine partner in the kitchen operation, not in the legal sense, just in the practical sense that the work was shared between two people who understood it equally and trusted each other's judgment. Marlowe had started paying her accordingly. Tomas turned 17 in November and announced, with the careful seriousness of someone who had thought about something for a long time before saying it, that he wanted to learn to read land survey documents. He'd been listening to enough conversations at the kitchen table over the past months that he'd formed his own opinions about where the most useful knowledge lay. "Why surveys specifically?" Marlowe asked. "Because that's where the lie starts," he said. "In the survey line. Everything else? The court process, the patent challenge, the legal fees, all of it comes after someone moves a line on a map." He paused. "If enough people understand how to read a survey correctly, it's harder to move the line without anyone noticing." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a very specific form of ambition." "I grew up in a territory where people lost land," he said simply. She arranged for him to begin studying with the surveyor who'd come with the Halverson family to the August gathering. A retired man named Cutler, who lived 20 miles south, and who, it turned out, had been looking for exactly this kind of student. The federal auditor's final report was published in the Territorial Bulletin on a Wednesday morning in late March, when the snow was still heavy on the upper passes, but the lower trails had been clear for 2 weeks, and the first spring traffic was beginning on the post road. Marlowe read it at the kitchen table before anyone else was awake. The oil lamp threw its uneven light across the pages, and she read slowly, making sure she was understanding what the formal language was actually saying underneath its careful layering of procedural terms. Roland Mercer had been formally removed from the position of territorial magistrate. His financial interests in the 3 land holding companies had been officially documented and entered into the federal record as undisclosed conflicts that had materially affected his official conduct. 19 of the 23 patent challenges identified in Clara Finch's documentation had been reversed. The remaining 4 were in various stages of active remediation, cases where the legal complexity was greater, where families had already sold or the land had changed hands multiple times. Those would take longer, maybe much longer. The auditor's report was honest about that. The survey records provided by Gideon's brother's contacts in Colorado, the pre-Mercer era documents showing the original lines, had been central to the reversal of 11 cases, the report noted. Gideon would want to know that specifically. She made a note to tell him before anything else. Aldous Crane's name appeared in an appendix, in connection with 3 of the reversed land transactions. He had not been charged with anything. The report described his involvement carefully, with the kind of language that meant the federal investigators knew exactly what he'd done, and also knew that what he'd done existed in the space between clearly illegal and demonstrably provable. He was not going to face formal consequences, and Marlowe had suspected as much for a while, and she had decided she could live with it. The world did not resolve into complete justice simply because you'd pushed hard enough in one direction. She'd known that going in. She knew it more specifically now. What Crane had lost was position. His supply network had contracted significantly over the winter. Several of the freight operators who'd been working with him had quietly shifted their business elsewhere once the investigation made his name a liability. The merchants who'd benefited from his price-setting arrangements were recalibrating. He was still in Harwick, still operating, still wearing the good coat, but the reach that had made him genuinely dangerous was smaller than it had been. And everyone on the routes knew it. She set the bulletin down and sat with the lamp in the quiet kitchen for a while. It wasn't the ending she'd have written, if endings were hers to write. 3 of the reversed families had lost more than the land itself. Years of legal fees, the disruption of children's schooling, businesses that had failed during the dispute period and couldn't simply be restarted because the patent was finally cleared. The reversal gave them their land back. It didn't give them back the years. Mercer would face federal proceedings, but those would take additional time, and the outcome was not guaranteed, and in the meantime he was somewhere with access to lawyers and resources, and the slow grinding defenses of a man who'd spent decades learning how institutional machinery worked. She thought about what Tomas had said. That's where the lie starts. In the survey line. He was right, and the fact that he was 17 and had already understood it meant something. It meant the understanding was spreading, passing to people who would carry it forward in ways she couldn't predict or control, which was how change actually worked when it worked at all, not through single moments of dramatic reversal, but through accumulation. Through enough people knowing enough things in enough places that the lie became harder to sustain. She'd played a part in that. She was willing to say so to herself, in the privacy of the kitchen before dawn, with no one listening. She'd played a part. She got up and started the fires. Tom. Gideon read the report at the work table an hour later while Marlowe was starting the morning prep. She heard him turn the pages. She didn't watch him. She gave him the space to have his own reaction to it, privately, the way she'd wanted her own. After a while he said, "The survey records." 11 cases, she said. "Your brother's contribution." A long pause. "I need to write to him." "You wrote in September." "I need to write again," he said. "This is different." He set the bulletin down. She could hear in his voice that the thing he'd been carrying for 3 years, the particular weight of watching his brother lose everything and being unable to stop it, had shifted into something else. Not gone. Never entirely gone. But different in the way that a stone is different after water has been moving over it for long enough. "After breakfast," she said. "Right after breakfast." He came to the kitchen doorway. "Are you all right?" he said. She considered the question honestly, the way it deserved. "I think so," she said. "Some of it went the way I hoped. Some of it didn't. The 4 families still in remediation." "Yes." She paused. "And Crane." "Crane lost the reach that mattered," Gideon said. "That's not nothing." "No," she said. "It's not nothing." She turned from the stove and looked at him in the kitchen doorway. This lean, weathered man who'd made a cruel joke in a fairgrounds hall 18 months ago and then spent a year and a half doing something about it. Who kept his dead brother's documents in a locked box and carried the weight of that quietly and competently and without making a performance of his own grief. Who had stood 8 feet to her left at the gathering and said, "Don't to a deputy's horse," with exactly the right amount of voice and not one syllable more. She'd been careful all her life about what she let herself want. Careful in the way that people who've had things taken from them tend to be. A constant low-level accounting of what she could afford to depend on, what she could risk, what would hurt too much to lose. That accounting had kept her functional through the hard years. It had also kept her, in certain specific ways, small. She was 31 years old and she was tired of the particular smallness of being careful about everything. "You should know something," she said. He waited. "When you made that offer after the competition," she said, I told myself I was considering it because it was a good business arrangement, and it was. That was true. She kept her eyes on him. But I also knew, standing in that fairgrounds parking area with my wagon half loaded, that you were someone I wanted to know better. That was also true. I didn't say it because it seemed impractical. Something moved in his face. A slow, careful shift, the way his expressions always moved, without hurry. I've been aware of that, he said. For a while. Have you? She said, dry. I didn't say anything because I didn't know if you'd want me to, he said. And because I was worried you'd think that the partnership was, that you were trying to make it something else. Yes. She turned back to the stove, checked what she was doing, turned back. I don't think that, she said. The partnership is what it is. This is a separate question. He looked at her for a long moment. What's the question? I haven't asked it yet, she said. I'm getting there. The corner of his mouth moved. She'd come to read that movement accurately over the past year. It was his version of a wide grin, and she'd stopped expecting it to look like anything more obvious than that. Take your time, he said. I'd like things to be different, she said. Between us, than they have been. She met his gaze. I'm not asking you to decide anything this morning. I'm telling you where I am so you know. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the post road was beginning to carry its morning traffic. She could hear a wagon on the grade below and the far-off sound of horses moving at pace. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and coffee and the morning's bread, which Ida would come in to manage in half an hour. I'd like that too, Gideon said. For the record. Good, she said. Go right to your brother. He pushed off the doorframe. He was almost back to the main room when she said, without turning around, and Gideon. Yeah. Don't make it shorter than it should be because you don't know how to say what you mean. He'll want to hear it all. A pause. How do you know that? Because he sent you those documents, she said. People who send documents don't want brevity. They want to know someone read them. She heard him exhale, a sound that carried something she couldn't name exactly, but recognized anyway. Then his footsteps moved away through the main room, and she heard the particular sound of the chair at his desk, and after a moment the scratch of pen on paper that told her he'd taken the advice. Clara Finch came to the post for the first time that spring, not on official business, just a visit, which was itself a kind of statement from a woman who'd spent 4 years being very deliberate about what she associated herself with officially. She arrived on a Saturday in April when the post was busy and sat at the far end of the kitchen table and drank coffee and watched the operation run. After a while she said, You've built something real here. We have, Marlowe said. She meant the we. Clara looked at Ida, who was working the morning service with the focused efficiency of someone who'd stopped being new at something, and at Tomas, who was in on Saturdays now and had developed the ability to do 3 things at once without dropping any of them. She looked at the kitchen space itself, the fireboxes, the counter heights, the organization of it, and at the steady movement of people through the main room and the kitchen, trappers and settlers and traders and ranch hands and families, the post-road traffic that had grown over 18 months into something that needed 3 people to handle properly. Mercer's federal proceedings are scheduled for June, Clara said. I'll be a witness. So will I, Marlowe said. Clara nodded. She looked at her coffee. I've been in this territory for 22 years, she said. I've watched a lot of things happen that shouldn't have happened, and I've tried to work within the boundaries of what I could actually do something about. She paused. I don't know if that was right. The arithmetic made sense, but I look at what happened last August, when 40 people showed up on this ridge, and I think about what might have happened if someone had pushed sooner. Clara, Marlowe said. She looked up. You kept the records for 4 years, Marlowe said. You showed up when it mattered. You brought Whitmore. She held the older woman's gaze. You did what you could do when you could do it. That's all any of us managed. Clara was quiet for a moment. You're more generous than I expected. I'm practical, Marlowe said. Spending energy on what should have happened differently is expensive and it doesn't cook the food. Clara made a sound that was almost a laugh, more than Marlowe had ever gotten from her before. She finished her coffee and stayed another hour, and when she left, she shook Marlowe's hand at the door and held it for a moment the same way Devereaux had, and Marlowe understood that this was how certain people said the things they didn't have language for. Gideon's brother wrote back in May. His name was Samuel, which Marlowe had known from the documents but had never heard Gideon say aloud. The letter was long, longer than anything she'd have expected from a man she'd built a picture of as someone who'd folded and left. It turned out that folding and leaving had not been the whole of him. He'd spent 3 years in Colorado doing exactly what Tomas was starting to do, learning survey work, building knowledge of land patent law, attaching himself to a federal land reform advocate who operated out of Denver and who was working cases in 3 territories. He was coming back to Wyoming in July, not to reclaim his specific land. That case was in remediation, the outcome uncertain, and he'd written with clear eyes about the possibility that it might not resolve in his favor. He was coming because there was work to do, and because the investigation had opened a window that wouldn't stay open indefinitely, and because his brother had sent him a letter in the fall that had said certain things that Marlowe had apparently advised not to make shorter than they should be. Gideon told her about Samuel's return over the evening meal after the Post had closed for the day. He told it plainly, the way he told things, but there was something different in how he held himself while he talked, a loosening, small but real, in the set of his shoulders. "He's bringing someone," Gideon said. "His wife. And the children." "How old are the children now?" 8 and 10. He paused. "They were 2 and 4 when they left." She thought about that. A man who'd been gone 3 years coming back to a territory that had broken him, with a wife and 2 children who barely remembered the place, on the strength of a federal window that might close again. It was not a safe decision. It was the kind of decision people made when they'd stopped being willing to let fear be the deciding factor. "We'll need to add a table," she said. Gideon looked at her. "For the kitchen. For July, when they come through, they'll eat here before they sort out where they're staying." She went back to her food. "We'll need a table." He was quiet for a moment. "You're assuming a lot." "I'm assuming a family coming off a long trip is hungry," she said. "That seems safe." He looked at her across the table with an expression she'd come to know over the months. The particular way his face settled when he was feeling something he didn't have a word for and wasn't going to invent one. She'd stopped needing the word. She could read what it meant. The frontier did not become simple because one corrupt official had been removed and one investigation had run its course. That was not how places worked. There were other men like Mercer in other territories, running the same machinery with different names on the documents. There were other cranes, repositioning rather than disappearing, waiting for the window to close. The railroad kept laying track and the land kept being contested, and the families who'd gotten their patents restored still had years of rebuilding ahead of them, with nothing to fill the gap that the lost years had left. What changed was smaller and more specific, and in the particular way of small specific things, more durable. The Gray Spine Post became the kind of place people trusted, not because it was comfortable or because it never had hard days. It had plenty of those. But because it operated the same way it had always operated, regardless of who was watching or what pressure was being applied, and people noticed that over time, the way they noticed anything that stayed consistent. The price board was the price board. The food was the food. A trapper and a settler family and a Crow elder could sit at the same table on a Saturday and receive the same treatment and pay the same price, and that fact, unremarkable on its face, radical in practice, turned out to be the thing the Post was known for, in the end, more than anything else. Tomas learned to read surveys. He was good at it. Within 2 years, he was helping families on the Post Road understand what their patents actually said, not charging for it, just doing it because he'd decided that was what he was for. Marlowe watched this without surprise. She'd seen him at the Y stage before he knew he was there. Ida Stroud stayed. She had nowhere particular to be and something she was good at in a kitchen that treated her like she knew what she was doing, which had not always been her experience. She and Marlowe developed the particular shorthand of people who've worked in close quarters long enough that they can communicate without finishing sentences, which Gideon observed once with an expression of mild bafflement that Marlowe found quietly satisfying. Mercer's federal proceedings concluded the following autumn with a conviction on 3 counts of fraudulent conduct in official capacity and removal of any further eligibility to hold territorial office. The sentence was 3 years and a substantial financial penalty. It was not, by the measure of everything he'd done, proportionate. Marlowe and Gideon and Clara Finch read the verdict in their separate locations, and each had their private accounting of what they felt about it. And none of those accountings were simple, and none of them were entirely satisfying. That was how accountability worked in practice, as opposed to principle. She'd stopped expecting practice and principle to match. That was not defeat. That was knowing the difference between what you could change and what you couldn't, and making sure you were working on the right one. So, on a morning in late October of that second year, Marlowe stood at the kitchen window in the early dark before anyone else was up, watching the first snow of the season come down on the granite outcropping. It was not heavy yet, just the beginning of it, the particular light snow that comes first in the mountains, tentative and thorough at the same time, covering everything in a layer thin enough that you could still see the ground underneath. She was 32 years old. She owned the kitchen she was standing in. The agreement that said so was in a locked box in her room, her name in block letters, witnessed and filed and federally recorded. Her mother's skillet was on the hook above the main firebox, where it hung every night and came down every morning, the iron seasoned black and smooth from years of use. She thought about the things she'd lost. There were real losses in her life, ones that didn't resolve and weren't supposed to. Her mother's kitchen, the boarding house, the years between 23 and 30 that had been survival more than living. She didn't pretend those years were fine. They were what they were. They'd made her capable in ways she wouldn't have chosen, which was how it usually went. She thought about this competition hall, the laughter, the weight of someone else's contempt landing on her across a crowded room. She thought about turning back to her cutting board and continuing to work, because there was food to finish and the food was more important than the feeling. That had been true. It was still true. But she'd also learned, slowly and with some difficulty, that there was a difference between managing a feeling and pretending it wasn't there, and that the managing worked better when you acknowledged the thing you were managing. She'd been hurt. She'd been dismissed and underestimated and laughed at in public, and she'd been robbed by family and pressed and threatened by powerful men who believed that their power meant they were allowed to determine what she could do and who she was allowed to be. All of that had been real, and she was still here, in her kitchen, with snow on the mountain and a fire to start, and a day's work ahead of her that she'd built herself piece by piece out of stubbornness and skill and the willingness to stand in the middle of something difficult without moving. That was the thing nobody told you about dignity. It wasn't a state you arrived at. It was a practice. It was a choice you made again every time something tried to take it from you, and the choice got easier. Not easy, just easier, the more times you'd made it before. She heard footsteps in the main room. Gideon, from the weight of them. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed but not quite awake, with the rumpled, unhurried quality he had in the early morning before the day had claimed him. He looked at the window, at the snow on the outcropping. "First one of the season," he said. Yes. He came in and went to the stove and started the fire without being asked, because he'd been doing it for over a year now, and he knew how she had the damper set, and he knew what the morning required. She watched him do it, the particular competence of someone who'd learned someone else's system well enough to be trusted with it. "Samuel and the family are settled at the Halverson place," he said. "As of last week," he wrote. "I know. I read the letter. He's already started on the patent remediation case for the Garfield family." A pause. "He says it looks promising." "Good," she said. He straightened up from the stove and looked at her, at the window, at her face, at the snow on the granite outside. He didn't say anything for a moment. That was fine. They'd gotten good at knowing which silences needed filling. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She considered being brief. She decided against it. "The competition," she said. "October before last. You in that judging hall." He was quiet. "I used to think about it and feel the sting of it," she said. "I don't, as much anymore." She turned to look at him. "That's not because it became okay. It's just because so much happened after." "That's a generous interpretation," he said. "It's a practical one," she said. "I'd rather use the memory for something than carry it." She paused. "You did something about it. That matters." He looked at her steadily. "I should have done something about it before you had to show me why." "Yes," she agreed. "But you didn't, and then you did, and I'm not interested in staying on the first part." She turned back to the window. "Start the coffee." He did. She began the morning prep, and the kitchen filled slowly with warmth and the smell of a new day starting, and outside the snow came down on the ridge in the early dark, thin and quiet, and covering everything in the particular way of first snows. not hiding what was there, just changing how it looked from the outside, leaving the ground itself exactly as it was underneath. The fire was burning well, the coffee was on, the day was beginning. That was enough. That had always been enough.